Maybe you're doing everything right, working hard, praying, being responsible, and still something feels heavier than it should. The joy didn't disappear all at once. It slowly became weight. This video exists for that specific moment, when faith is still there, but the heart feels tired. Here, you'll discover the biblical path to rebuilding joy, not as a passing emotion, but as an inner strength that sustains you even when circumstances don't change. We'll look at clear principles from Scripture, understand why joy gets lost under the weight of routine, pressure, and waiting, and how it can be restored in a practical and spiritual way. Have you been moving forward without enthusiasm? Carrying too many responsibilities in silence? Have you ever wondered why your life with God seems correct but not light? If this describes what you're living right now, stay until the end. This message may realign something deep within you. There is a nearly imperceptible moment in the Christian walk when following Jesus stops being a living response of the heart and begins to feel like a well-managed responsibility. The person keeps doing everything they've always done, praying, working, serving, persevering, but something inside no longer moves with the same willingness. There is no rebellion, no conscious decision to drift away. There is only a gradual loss of lightness that slowly becomes normal over time. This kind of wear is difficult to identify because, externally, nothing seems wrong. Spiritual life keeps functioning. There is discipline, commitment, and even visible growth. The problem is that the center of motivation has shifted. The relationship with God no longer holds the primary place. It has been displaced by duty, expectation, pressure, or fear of failing. Faith remains active, but it no longer flows from the same source. When that happens, obedience stops being a natural response of love and starts being sustained by effort. The person doesn't pray because they long to be with God, but because they know they should pray. They don't serve because something overflows within them, but because they feel they can't stop. Gradually, spirituality begins to function like a maintenance system, not a place of encounter. This creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. It's not physical tiredness, nor the common emotional fatigue of life. It's a quiet, spiritual weariness that appears when the heart learns how to comply but forgets how to engage. Joy doesn't disappear all at once. It slowly gets replaced by weight, by a constant sense of obligation, by a faith that requires continuous effort just to be sustained. Jesus addressed this directly when he said, "You have abandoned your first love." This statement is profound because it wasn't spoken to people who had walked away, lost interest, or become careless. It was spoken to people who were active, faithful, and persevering. The issue wasn't a lack of practice, but the loss of an inner priority. They were still doing many right things, but no longer from the love that had first moved them. First love doesn't refer to initial emotion or temporary enthusiasm. It refers to the place from which faith is born. When that place shifts, everything may continue to function for a while, but it begins to cost something internally. Faith stops sustaining the heart and starts demanding constant strength, and what was meant to bring relief begins unintentionally to apply pressure. Many people interpret this weariness as a sign of spiritual weakness. They assume they are failing, that they are not being good Christians, or that something is wrong with their faith. But most of the time, the issue isn't a lack of faith. It's an excess of responsibility taken on without enough relationship to sustain it. Life with God starts to feel like something that must be maintained, protected, and defended at all times. There is no space for inner rest. The heart stays on alert, trying not to fail, not to disappoint, not to stop. And this constant state of spiritual vigilance leads to exhaustion, even when everything looks correct on the surface. It's important to notice that joy fades before faith disappears. The person still believes, still obeys, still follows, but there is no lightness anymore, no pleasure, no rest. This is where many begin to quit internally, even while continuing externally. Quitting rarely begins with a clear decision. It begins with love no longer being the central motivation. Jesus doesn't expose this pattern to accuse, but to call the heart back. The implicit invitation isn't do more, but return to the right place. When relationship returns to the center, responsibility stops being a burden and becomes a consequence again. Obedience stops being effort and becomes response. Recognizing this shift is essential to rebuilding joy. It's not about abandoning spiritual practices, but about reorganizing inner priorities. When love takes the center again, faith stops feeling heavy, even if circumstances don't change. And it is from this quiet reorganization that the path to restoration begins to open in a consistent way. When spiritual routine begins to replace presence, the process is so subtle that it's rarely noticed at first. The person keeps praying, reading the Bible, attending church, and fulfilling spiritual responsibilities, but does so more and more automatically. There is no conscious rejection of God, no abandonment of faith. What changes is the level of inner engagement. The heart no longer follows with the same attention what the hands continue to do. This shift often happens as an adaptation to adult life, daily pressure, and emotional overload. Routine emerges as a way to keep faith organized when time is short and the mind is full. And discipline does have value. The problem begins when routine stops being a path toward God and becomes a substitute for encountering Him. The person fulfills spiritual habits, but no longer notices whether they were truly in God's presence during them. There is a deep difference between spiritual practice and spiritual presence. Practice can be maintained even when the heart is distant. Presence, however, requires attention, openness, and listening. When routine takes control, spirituality remains active but loses depth. Prayer happens without awareness of the inner state. Scripture is read without allowing it to confront or realign. Service continues without noticing that the heart is tired or empty. Over time, this way of living faith creates a strange sensation. Everything seems right, but nothing feels alive. The person can explain the faith, knows the biblical texts, and maintains correct behavior, yet struggles to perceive God's presence in a real way. Spirituality becomes something done for God, not something lived with Him. And this shift, though subtle, has deep effects on inner joy. Jesus described this exact pattern when He said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." This is not an accusation of deliberate hypocrisy, but a diagnosis of emotional distance. The words are correct, behaviors are aligned, and intentions may even be sincere, but the heart is not engaged. Faith is expressed externally, while the interior remains disconnected. This kind of distance is dangerous because it doesn't trigger immediate warning signs. The person doesn't feel like they are drifting from God, since they continue talking about Him, thinking about Him, and working for Him. The distance doesn't occur at the level of belief, but at the level of intimacy. And when this disconnection lasts, the heart begins to feel a void that's difficult to name, even within an apparently active spiritual life. Routine then sustains the appearance of faith, but no longer sustains inner life. The person stays strong on the outside, but feels something dry on the inside. Prayer no longer brings real rest. Scripture doesn't renew like before. Serving becomes heavy. And still they continue, believing that this dryness is part of spiritual growth or just a normal phase of the journey. At this point, many confuse faithfulness with automatism. Remaining does not mean repeating actions without presence. The Christian faith was never designed to be merely correct, but relational. When routine replaces presence, spirituality becomes functional, organized, and predictable, but no longer transformative. And this creates a silent wear that accumulates over time. slowly eroding joy without the person realizing exactly when it began. This is where silent quitting starts to take shape. Not as a conscious decision to stop, but as a heart that learns how to function without closeness. The person doesn't abandon God, but no longer feels a desire to draw near. They continue out of discipline, not out of spiritual hunger. And this prolonged state produces a faith that endures, but does not rejoice. Recognizing this pattern is not an invitation to abandon routine, but to recover its purpose. Spiritual practices do not exist to replace presence, but to lead into it. When the heart is included again, with honesty, attention, and openness, routine stops being a burden and becomes a path once more. This inner adjustment is essential for joy to be rebuilt in a real, deep, and sustainable way. When the weight grows faster than grace, the walk with Jesus begins to lose the original balance he himself established. The person keeps believing, keeps obeying, and keeps wanting to please God, yet feels more and more that they are carrying something too heavy to sustain for long. The exhaustion doesn't come from a single mistake or a specific crisis, but from a quiet accumulation that forms over time. That weight almost never arrives all at once. It's added little by little as new responsibilities, expectations, and demands are incorporated into spiritual life without discernment. The person doesn't notice when faith stops being a place of support and becomes a place where more and more is placed. And by the time they realize it, they are trying to carry far more than they were ever called to carry. In many Christian settings, this accumulation is mistaken for spiritual maturity. Maturity becomes associated with enduring more pressure, taking on more tasks, dealing with more people, and maintaining the appearance of emotional stability. Complaining seems like a lack of faith. Questioning the weight feels like immaturity, and so the person learns to silence their own weariness. The problem is that not every burden looks wrong at first. Many loads are disguised as zeal, responsibility, or spiritual commitment. Expectations from leaders, demands from the community, unspoken religious standards, and even internal pressure are assumed as if all of them were part of God's calling. Rarely does the person pause to separate what Jesus clearly asked from what was taken on out of fear, comparison, or the desire to measure up. Over time, this excess begins to shape how faith is lived. Spirituality becomes marked by constant effort. The person lives trying not to fail, not to disappoint, not to displease. The heart remains in a state of continual vigilance, as if any pause were dangerous. This state consumes emotional and spiritual energy deeply, even when everything appears to be working on the outside. Jesus directly confronts this pattern when he says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." This statement is revealing because it doesn't deny the existence of a yoke or a burden in the Christian life. It redefines their source and nature. The problem isn't carrying something, it's carrying what was never given by him. When the burden becomes too heavy, it doesn't point to a lack of commitment, but to misalignment between what was assumed and what was truly asked. Spiritual exhaustion most of the time doesn't come from faith itself, but from excess. Excess emotional responsibility, excess human expectation, excess self-pressure, and excess control. The person tries to sustain faith by sheer strength when faith was designed to be sustained by grace. And the more they try to compensate for fatigue with effort, the farther they drift from the rest that was promised. At this stage, resting begins to produce guilt. Slowing down feels irresponsible. Saying no sounds like disobedience. The person feels that if they stop, everything might collapse. They keep going not because they are being sustained, but because they believe they cannot stop. This is a clear sign that the weight has exceeded the measure of grace available at that pace of life. Many end up quitting at this point, not because they reject Jesus, but because they never learned how to rest in him. They try to sustain faith on their own when the invitation was always to walk with him. Exhaustion becomes so constant that it starts to feel normal, as if following Jesus inevitably meant living drained. Recognizing that the weight has grown faster than grace is not a sign of spiritual weakness, but of discernment. Jesus never invited anyone into a life of continual depletion. The call has always been to learn from him, walk with him, and carry only what he places upon us. When the weight begins to be reorganized, grace regains space to work. This process begins with an honest and necessary question. What am I carrying that Jesus never asked me to carry? That question doesn't produce immediate answers, but it opens an inner space for alignment. In that space, faith begins to recover lightness, not because responsibilities disappear, but because they are no longer sustained by human strength alone. And when this adjustment begins, something changes inside. The heart starts to breathe again. The journey stops being only resistance and gradually regains balance. This isn't the end of the process, but it is a decisive point where grace once again begins to accompany the weight in a healthy way. When waiting stretches beyond what the heart can sustain, something begins to wear down, inside almost imperceptibly. The person keeps believing, keeps praying, and keeps saying they trust God, but no longer knows exactly how to wait. Time passes, circumstances remain the same, and hope, which once brought strength and direction, begins to produce fatigue. What weighs most isn't the pain itself, but the sense of remaining in a long process without clarity, without signs, and without inner renewal. At the beginning of waiting, there is still spiritual energy. The person believes God is at work, even when they can't see it. There is expectation, patience, and even inner growth. Waiting is lived as part of the journey. But as days accumulate, as prayers seem to yield no visible answer, and as silence stretches on, something changes. Faith still exists, but the heart grows tired of sustaining expectation for so long. Scripture describes this effect with great precision. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. This verse doesn't criticize hope or diminish the value of waiting. It reveals the impact of prolonged delay when hope is not renewed along the way. Waiting by itself does not automatically strengthen. When waiting becomes too long without inner renewal, it begins to weaken what it was meant to sustain. Many people continue waiting externally while quitting internally. They maintain the right posture, repeat their prayers, and remain steady in visible faith, but no longer wait with the same heart. Hope stops being alive and becomes something merely remembered. The heart learns to function in survival mode, trying not to lose faith entirely while carrying the accumulated frustration of time. This kind of wear is especially difficult because it doesn't show up in clear actions. The person doesn't abandon God, doesn't break with faith, and doesn't drastically change behavior. They simply grow tired of waiting. Waiting, which should be a space for maturation and strengthening, begins to feel like stagnation. And little by little, joy weakens without the person being able to clearly point to why. Another element that intensifies this inner sickness is quiet comparison. While some seem to move forward, receive answers, or experience rapid change, others remain in the same place. This creates a sense of being forgotten, as if God were attentive to everyone's story except their own. Waiting stops being merely long and starts to feel unfair. And when this feeling goes unrecognized, it slowly corrodes hope. In many cases, what a person abandons isn't Jesus, but expectation. They continue believing in God, but stop expecting something from Him with the same openness. They adjust expectations to avoid being disappointed again. They reduce hope as a form of self-protection. This mechanism is understandable, but it carries a high cost. It drains spiritual vitality and weakens inner joy. Waiting without active hope is one of the most exhausting states in the Christian life. There is no specific pain to treat, no concrete answer to hold on to. There is only a prolonged time that seems not to move forward. The person remains faithful, but feels like they are merely enduring, not truly living. This is one of the moments when many begin to ask quietly whether continuing to wait still makes sense. Recognizing that prolonged waiting is making the heart sick is not a sign of weak faith, but of spiritual maturity. God does not ignore the impact of time on the human heart. He doesn't call anyone into empty waiting, but into sustained waiting. Biblical hope doesn't deny weariness. It finds ways of inner renewal while the process continues. That renewal doesn't always come when circumstances change. Often it begins when the heart learns to wait differently. When hope stops being anchored only to outcomes and starts finding support in God's presence along the way, something begins to reorganize inside. And it is from that reorganization that joy can begin to return, even before the final answer arrives. When comparison begins to distort calling, the joy of one's personal journey starts to fade almost inevitably. The person doesn't stop loving God or abandon faith, but begins to see their own path through the lens of other people's journeys. What once was a purpose-driven walk starts to be evaluated by visible results, speed of progress, and external recognition. And without realizing it, the heart stops walking in peace. This process rarely begins in an obvious way. Comparison emerges through simple, almost automatic thoughts. Why did someone else move forward faster? Why did God answer their prayer and not mine? Why does my process always seem slower, quieter, harder? These questions don't come from open envy, but from a tired heart trying to understand why its own story feels less clear. Once comparison takes hold, it changes the standard by which faith is measured. The person stops asking whether they are being faithful to what God asked of them and starts asking whether they are doing as well as others. The focus shifts away from relationship with God and moves toward perceived spiritual performance. Faith is no longer lived before God, but evaluated against people, contexts, and different stories. Scripture offers clear guidance when it says, each one should test their own actions. This principle doesn't promote spiritual isolation, but healthy discernment. It protects the heart from measuring obedience by standards it was never given. God doesn't call people to identical paths. He calls individuals, each with different histories, seasons, and formations. When this principle is ignored, comparison begins to blur direction. One of the most common effects of comparison is a constant sense of falling behind. The person feels as though they are always late, even when they are exactly where they should be. Real progress goes unnoticed because it doesn't resemble someone else's progress. Inner growth loses value because it isn't as visible or celebrated. This creates a quiet spiritual frustration that builds over time. Comparison also deeply distorts the perception of calling. What God is forming within begins to feel small compared to what others are experiencing externally. The value of process is diminished. Daily faithfulness starts to feel irrelevant. The heart begins to desire experiences, positions, or results that were never entrusted to it, believing that true joy must be found there. This inner state creates constant tension. The person never feels like they are doing enough, even when they are being faithful. Never feels like they've arrived, even when they've advanced. They live trying to reach a standard God never set for them. This constant striving quietly drains joy because the heart ends up living in silent competition, even within faith. Comparison also affects how a person interprets God's work. When God moves differently in the lives of others, it can start to feel like inequality, neglect, or even favoritism. The heart loses its ability to rest in God's sovereignty and begins to question its own worth before Him. Faith remains, but becomes emotionally unstable and insecure. Over time, comparison steals something essential: gratitude for one's own path. The person stops noticing what God has already done, what he is doing now, and what he is still building in silence. Their gaze stays outward. And when gratitude weakens, joy loses ground, because the heart begins to live with a constant sense of lack. Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean ignoring other people's journeys, but restoring focus to the right place. God never asked anyone to live by comparing paths. He asked for faithfulness, attentiveness, and obedience to what was entrusted to each person. When the heart returns to this place, something begins to realign internally. Joy starts to be restored when a person learns to honor their own rhythm, their own process, and their own calling. Not because the road became easier, but because it began to make sense again. Comparison loses power when identity is affirmed before God, not before others. This realignment doesn't happen instantly. It begins with a simple yet profound internal decision: to stop measuring one's faith by standards that did not come from God. From that decision, the heart begins to experience peace along the path it was given, and that peace creates space for joy to grow again in a genuine and sustainable way. When faith begins to be lived as continuous effort rather than relationship, something essential shifts at the foundation of the Christian walk. The person keeps following Jesus, keeps obeying, and keeps doing what they believe is right, but feels as though they are sustaining everything alone. Faith stops being a place of encounter and becomes a field of constant resistance. Instead of nourishing the heart, it demands ongoing strength just to survive. This pattern usually forms when spiritual life is built almost entirely on discipline. Discipline has value and is necessary, but when it becomes the central axis, it turns faith into something dependent on human performance. The person learns to persevere by willpower, not by living connection. They remain steady out of responsibility, not out of real dependence on Christ. And over time, this model exacts a heavy inner cost. Many Christians live in this state without realizing it. Spiritual routines remain organized, moral decisions remain correct, commitment stays visible. Yet the heart is constantly tired. There is a persistent sense that one must hold on a little longer, try harder, be spiritually stronger. Faith becomes something that must be sustained, protected, and maintained at the expense of continuous inner energy. Jesus directly confronts this logic when he says, "Apart from me, you can do nothing." This statement doesn't remove human responsibility, but redefines the source of spiritual strength. Faith was never designed to be sustained by human capacity, but by connection to Him. When that connection stops being central, all that remains is effort. And effort without renewal inevitably leads to exhaustion. At this point, the person begins to confuse perseverance with resistance. Resistance is enduring without relief, merely out of obligation. Abiding is remaining connected, even amid difficulty. When faith becomes resistance, it grows heavy because the heart finds no renewal. When faith is abiding, it remains demanding, but is sustained by something greater than personal strength. Another sign of this pattern is difficulty recognizing limits. The person believes that depending on Jesus means never stopping, never resting, and never showing weakness. They try to remain constant without renewal. They try to abide without nourishment. They try to obey without support. Gradually, spiritual life becomes defined more by obligation than by living relationship. This kind of faith produces a tense spirituality. The heart lives on alert, trying not to fail, not to disappoint, not to displease God. The person learns to watch constantly, but forgets how to rest. Joy finds no room, because everything revolves around staying strong at any cost. And that cost is almost always the lightness of the journey. Many quit exactly here, not because they lost faith in Jesus, but because they are exhausted from trying to sustain faith on their own. They don't reject Christ. They reject the weight they've learned to associate with Christian life. Quitting feels like relief for those who have lived too long in continuous effort without enough relationship to support that pace. It's important to understand that Jesus never invited anyone into a self-sustained faith. The invitation has always been to abide in him. Abiding implies dependence, not performance. It means recognizing limits, not hiding them. It means returning to the source repeatedly, instead of trying to generate strength alone. Healthy faith isn't the one that never gets tired, but the one that knows where to be renewed. When faith returns to its place as relationship, something begins to change internally. Effort doesn't disappear, but it stops being solitary. Obedience continues, but now comes with ongoing renewal. The heart learns that it doesn't have to sustain everything because it was never created to do so. There is a real exchange. Weakness is acknowledged and strength begins to come from another place. This realignment requires spiritual humility. It means admitting that trying to be strong all the time may actually be a disguised form of independence. Jesus doesn't call his followers to prove strength, but to learn dependence. And it is through that learning that faith stops being a constant burden and becomes a path again. When this shift begins to take place, joy finds space once more. Not as fleeting enthusiasm, but as inner rest. Faith remains demanding, but no longer exhausting. And this adjustment prepares the heart to understand where joy is truly restored, not as emotion, but as strength that sustains the journey. Where joy is restored, quitting loses its power, not because the problems disappear, but because the heart stops depending exclusively on circumstances to remain steady. Biblical joy does not arise as a light feeling that accompanies good days. It appears as an inner strength that sustains a person when the days remain difficult. That's why so many Christians become confused, expecting to feel joy only when everything improves, without realizing that the joy of the Lord was designed to sustain us precisely when nothing changes. Scripture states clearly, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." This declaration was not made in a comfortable or emotionally stable context. It emerged in a moment of rebuilding, collective fatigue, and deep awareness of personal failure. The people were tired, emotionally worn down, and spiritually fragile. The joy mentioned there was not enthusiasm or euphoria, but the strength required to keep rebuilding without collapsing inside. This reveals something essential. Biblical joy does not deny pain, erase weight, or speed up processes. It acts as support. It prevents weariness from turning into quitting. It keeps the heart steady when the mind is confused and when answers have not yet arrived. This joy does not shout, impose itself, or draw attention. It sustains quietly. The restoration of this joy begins when a person stops seeking relief only in changing circumstances and returns to the source. Many live by conditioning joy on outcomes, answers, or external resolutions. They believe they will only be able to breathe once the problem ends. But the joy of the Lord does not come from the end of the struggle. It comes from reconnection with God in the middle of it. It is a joy that does not depend on controlling the situation, but on renewed trust. This is one of the most important points of the entire journey. Joy is not restored when everything is resolved, but when the heart stops carrying alone what it was never meant to sustain. When a person stops trying to maintain faith through human effort alone and allows God to sustain the inner life, something changes. Joy begins to reappear quietly, gradually, and consistently. This joy does not remove responsibilities, but it changes how they are carried. The weight still exists, but it no longer crushes. Waiting remains, but it no longer makes the heart sick. Faith stays demanding, but it stops being exhausting. Joy functions as an inner axis that restores balance when everything around feels unstable. Another clear sign of restored joy is a shift in how a person relates to time. They still wait, but are no longer consumed by waiting. They still walk forward, but without the constant sense of delay or failure. They still face challenges, but without the pressure to constantly prove spiritual worth. Joy reorganizes the inner rhythm, even when the outer rhythm remains intense and demanding. This joy also brings clarity back. The heart begins to discern what truly matters. Comparisons lose strength, misplaced expectations start to be released, burdens that never came from God begin to be questioned. The person does not become indifferent to life, but learns to walk with greater awareness and less inner oppression. At this point, quitting truly begins to lose ground, not because the road became easy, but because it began to make sense again. The heart finds enough support to continue without losing itself. Faith stops being mere resistance and becomes relationship again. The journey remains long, but no longer feels empty. There is strength to remain without becoming hardened. Those who rediscover this kind of joy do not become immune to weariness, but they learn not to abandon themselves within it. They learn to recognize limits without guilt. They learn to return to the source without shame. They learn that joy is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God, sustaining the heart in the midst of it. This restoration does not mark the end of the journey, but a deep realignment. The joy of the Lord does not end challenges. It sustains the crossing. It does not speed up the process, but it prevents the process from destroying the inner life. And when this joy returns to its rightful place, faith matures, weight loses its dominance, and the heart finds enough strength to keep going, not merely enduring, but remaining with meaning. As you reach this point, you may begin to realize that the weariness you were carrying was not a sign of drifting from God, nor proof that your faith was weakening. It was, in fact, a sign of misalignment. Over time, something was placed on your shoulders, expectations, rhythms, comparisons, responsibilities that were never meant to occupy the center of your walk with Jesus. Recognizing this does not diminish your faith. On the contrary, it matures it. Throughout this journey, it became clear that biblical joy does not disappear all at once. It gets compressed when relationship turns into obligation, when presence becomes routine, when weight grows faster than grace, when waiting stretches on without renewal, when comparison steals identity, and when faith is sustained only by human effort. None of this happens through rebellion. It happens through fatigue. But it also became clear that joy is not recovered through willpower or superficial adjustments. It is restored when the heart returns to the right place. When faith stops being something you try to sustain alone and becomes something lived in dependence again. When you stop merely enduring the path and relearn how to walk with Jesus, not ahead of him, not behind him, but with him. Your circumstances may not have changed yet. The waiting may still be there. Some answers may not have arrived. But if something has begun to reorganize inside you, that itself is a sign of restoration. The joy of the Lord does not remove the process. It gives strength to move through it without losing yourself. It does not speed up time, but it sustains the heart while time passes. Following Jesus was never about carrying everything correctly. It has always been about learning how to carry with him. When this realignment happens, faith remains demanding, but it stops being exhausting. The weight does not disappear, but it loses the power to crush. The journey stays long, but it begins to make sense again. If in silence you sense that you need to release something, a rhythm, a pressure, an expectation, do not rush that movement. Simply acknowledge it. Sometimes the first step of restoration is not doing something new, but stopping the effort to sustain what was never asked of you. It is in that space that grace begins to breathe again, and joy finds room to return. From here on, may you not simply keep following, but follow with greater awareness, deeper dependence, and less weight. Not because everything became easy, but because the heart returned to the right rhythm. And when that happens, Quitting stops feeling like an option because remaining becomes possible again, with meaning and with life.